Hey yo, listen.
Drop it low to the flow. Oh.
Like it like that.
Yeah. Oh. Are you ready for this?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a pretty serious issue in England: youth violence and knife crime. You sent us some articles from The Guardian and BBC News.
Wow.
We'll take a look at those together and try to make sense of what's going on.
Yeah, it's a really important topic. And these articles, they really give us a lot to consider.
Yeah, they do. So let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
Just how big of a problem is this? The BBC article about the teenage homicides in London, those numbers were really alarming.
They were. They reported 21 teenage homicides in London just last year in 2023.
Wow.
Which is a big jump from 14 the year before.
Oh, wow.
And out of those 21, 18 were stabbings.
18 out of 21.
Yeah. And what really hits home is that some of these victims, like Elian Andom and Harry Pittman, they were just living their lives, going to school, celebrating New Year's Eve.
Right.
And then suddenly their lives are cut short.
It's terrifying to think that this could happen to anyone. And the BBC article, it quotes Talisha Gupal. Her brother was a victim of knife violence. And she says, anyone can be a victim of knife crime. It's become so normal in our society now to hear about kids dying.
Right.
Is that what it's like for young people in England these days? Is it really that normalized?
Well, the Ofsted report, which is a schools inspectorate in England,
Right.
paints a pretty grim picture, unfortunately. They're warning that serious youth violence, it's a problem all over the country. And it's affecting children as young as 11.
11? That's so young.
Yeah.
What's causing this? Why are kids even thinking about carrying knives?
The Ofsted report says a lot of these kids are carrying knives for quote-unquote protection. They just don't feel safe.
Right.
They're growing up around violence, and so to them, carrying a knife seems like the only choice they have.
So it's this vicious cycle, right? More violence means more young people feel they need to arm themselves, which leads to even more violence.
Exactly. It's complicated, and it goes really deep.
So if it's not just about the knives themselves, what are some of the solutions that people are talking about?
Well, there seem to be two main ways people are thinking about tackling this. One is tougher laws and tougher punishments.
Okay.
And the other focuses more on prevention, intervening early.
Okay.
For example, the government, they're trying to ban zombie knives.
Oh, yeah, those huge, scary-looking knives. I've seen pictures. But will banning specific types of knives actually solve the problem?
Well, some people don't think so. They say this is like the government's third try at banning these weapons since 2016.
Really?
Yeah. And the new rules, they don't even start until September. So critics are saying it feels like a temporary fix for a much bigger problem.
Yeah, like they're trying to get rid of one type of knife and then another one just pops up. Someone really wants to use a knife, they'll find a way, right? It doesn't have to be a zombie knife to be dangerous.
That's right. And then you have the whole debate about mandatory sentences for carrying a knife.
Right, so no matter why someone's carrying a knife, they automatically go to jail. Is that something people generally support?
It's actually quite a divisive issue. You have people like Grace O'Malley Kumar's parents. They tragically lost their daughter in the Nottingham attacks.
Right.
They're pushing for stricter sentences because they think it might stop people from carrying knives in the first place.
Yeah, I can see their point. They don't want any other family to go through what they've been through.
Absolutely. But then you have others like Idris Elba, who's been very vocal about tackling knife crime.
Yeah.
He's cautioned against a one-size-fits-all approach. He says mandatory sentences might not actually work and could unfairly target young people from disadvantaged backgrounds.
So it's a really complex issue. On the one hand, you want justice, but on the other, you need to address all these complicated social factors that are driving this violence.
Exactly. And that's where the second approach comes in, the prevention and early intervention. The Labour Party, for instance, they're proposing they invest like $100 million in a national youth program.
That's a lot of money. What would that program actually do?
The idea is to give at-risk youth support and resources to help them make better choices and stay away from violence. Things like mentorship programs,
Okay.
after-school activities, job training. They want to address the root causes, not just react after something bad happens.
So being proactive and addressing the social and economic issues that might lead a young person to carry a knife.
Exactly. And this approach lines up with a lot of what the Ofsted report and their press release are recommending. They really dig deep into the systemic problems at play here.
That's what I find so interesting, the idea that it's not just about kids making bad choices, it's a whole system that's failing them.
It is. And the report really emphasizes the need for different organizations to work together, like social services, schools, the police, healthcare providers. They all need to collaborate to tackle this problem.
So it's not just about more police officers or harsher punishments. It's about all these different groups coming together to support these young people and address the underlying issues.
Precisely. And that support, it needs to be tailored to each community because the problems and the risks, they're not the same everywhere. What works in one town might not work in another.
That makes sense. It's about understanding each community and then figuring out what solutions will actually work for them.
Right. But the report also points out some serious flaws in how some areas are handling this. Like some local safeguarding partnerships, those are the groups responsible for protecting children, they aren't even identifying serious violence as a safeguarding issue.
Wait, seriously? That seems like a huge oversight. How can they possibly address it if they don't even recognize it as a problem?
It is a concern. And there are even cases where professionals are blaming the children for the harm they experience. They're not seeing them as victims who need protection. And what's really disturbing is that this kind of adultification, where adults don't see how vulnerable these kids are, it seems to disproportionately affect Black children.
That's just awful. It sounds like these biases are stopping these kids from getting the help they need.
It does seem that way. And to make matters worse, the report says the government isn't giving clear guidance on how these organizations should be working together to support kids who are facing harm outside their homes. So this lack of direction is making things even worse.
So we have some good things happening, but there are still huge gaps in the system that leave vulnerable children exposed to violence. And on top of that, the report found a link between youth violence and unmet needs.
Right.
Especially for kids who might be considered neurodivergent.
Yes, that's right. Like those with autism or ADHD.
Right. So the report is saying both the government and local agencies, they need to do a much better job of addressing the needs of these at-risk children, especially those with sufficient educational needs and disabilities.
Absolutely. And the support can't just be about practical things like educational resources or mental health services. It also has to be about building empathy and understanding. Research commissioned by Ofsted from Safer London, they found that children and parents affected by this violence often feel a lack of empathy from the professionals they interact with.
That's really sad, to go through something so traumatic and then feel like the people who are supposed to help you don't even understand what you're going through.
It is. But on a more hopeful note, that same research found that when support systems are working well, families really value practical help. It's not just about words, it's about actions that actually make a difference.
It sounds like what we need is a much more understanding and comprehensive approach to tackling this. It's not just about stopping the violence, but about supporting those who have been affected and building a system where they feel seen, heard, and supported.
I agree.
Well, this has really opened my eyes to this issue. It's clear youth violence and knife crime are incredibly complicated problems with no easy solutions.
Right.
But it's not just about tougher laws or more police. It's about understanding all these social, economic, and systemic factors that are feeding this crisis. And it's about all of us working together to create a more just and fair society where young people actually feel safe and supported.
Absolutely. And while we've been focused on England, it's important to remember that this isn't just a UK problem. These are global challenges.
That's a good point. It's easy to get focused on what's happening in one place, but these issues are happening all over the world.
Yeah, and I think it'd be interesting for you to look into what's happening in your own community, see if there are similar trends and what people are doing about it.
I think I will. This conversation has really made me want to learn more about what's going on closer to home.
Good.
You know, as we're talking about this, I keep thinking about that quote from Ofsted's chief inspector, Sir Martin Oliver.
Yeah.
He called knife crime a national scandal, and he said, some kids, as young as 11, feel like they have to carry a knife for protection.
Right.
It's just awful.
It is. It really shows the reality these young people are facing. When kids feel so unsafe that they think they need to arm themselves,
Right.
it means we as a society have failed to make them feel protected.
It makes you wonder what we can even do about it. I mean, this is such a huge problem, and we've only just started talking about it. How can we possibly make a difference?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but remember, change starts with awareness.
Right.
Just by talking about this issue, learning about how complex it is, and thinking about the solutions people are proposing, you're already doing something.
So knowledge is power, but what about actually doing something? What can we do to help?
Well, think about that web of social and systemic factors that are contributing to youth violence. There are people and organizations working within that web to make positive changes.
Okay.
They're the ones who are really out there working with at-risk youth, fighting for better policies, and trying to stop this cycle of violence.
So how can we support them?
Well, there are a few things you can do. You can start by researching organizations in your community that work with at-risk youth,
Okay.
or that advocate for policies that prevent violence.
Yeah.
A lot of these organizations need volunteers and donations, so even a small amount of your time or money can make a difference.
That's a great idea. I bet there are tons of people doing amazing work who could use some extra help.
Definitely. And another way to get involved is through advocacy. Contact your local representatives
Okay.
and tell them this is something you care about. Tell them you support policies and programs that focus on prevention and early intervention.
So using our voices to push for change from the top down?
Exactly. And don't forget the power of just talking about it. Have conversations with your friends, family, and colleagues about what you've learned.
Right.
The more we talk about these things openly, the less of a taboo they become, and the more likely we are to actually do something about them.
It's like that saying, a problem shared is a problem halved. By talking about it, we're saying, this is our problem and we need to solve it together.
Exactly. And change often starts small, at the local level. By getting involved in your community,
Yeah.
you can help to create a safer and more supportive place for young people, and that can spread outwards.
So we've talked about how big this problem is, the different approaches people are suggesting, the importance of everyone working together, and the need for a more holistic approach. It's a lot, and it can feel a bit overwhelming.
It's true. But even small actions can make a difference.
Right.
The important thing is to stay informed, engage with your community, and speak up for change.
Speaking of staying informed, I'm curious about your thoughts on some of the specific things we talked about earlier,
Okay.
like banning zombie knives and those mandatory sentences for carrying a knife.
Yeah.
Do you think those would actually work?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that the goal behind these proposals is a good one. The government is trying to deal with a very serious problem. But whether these specific measures will actually be effective is a different question.
How so?
Well, take the ban on zombie knives, for example. They're scary looking, and they don't belong in our society.
Right.
But the truth is, anyone who wants to hurt someone can find a way to do it, whether they're using a zombie knife or just a regular kitchen knife.
So it's like they're trying to treat the symptom, not the disease. You get rid of one type of weapon, but the problem is still there.
Exactly. And then there's the whole debate about mandatory sentences for carrying a knife. We heard arguments from both sides. Some people believe it'll make people think twice before carrying a knife.
Right.
And others are worried it'll punish young people unfairly, especially first-time offenders, without getting to the reasons why they're carrying knives in the first place.
It's that tension we were talking about earlier, right? Finding a balance between wanting justice and needing to understand all the factors that lead to this behavior.
Yes. And with these mandatory sentences, we have to think about what might happen that we don't want. Would it actually stop young people from carrying knives?
Right.
Or would it just lead to more young people, many from disadvantaged backgrounds, ending up in the criminal justice system? And would they even have a chance to turn their lives around afterwards?
It's a tough question. On one hand, people should be held accountable for their actions, especially when those actions can have such devastating consequences.
But then again, is punishment really the best way to deal with a problem this complicated?
That's the core of the debate, isn't it? And both sides make valid points. We need to have open and honest discussions about these different approaches, weighing the pros and cons, and considering everyone's perspective.
Out of all this information, what stands out to you the most? What's the one thing you think our listeners really need to understand?
I think the most important takeaway is that youth violence and knife crime aren't isolated problems. They're symptoms of much deeper issues. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, failing schools, and a lack of support from the community.
So we're not just talking about individuals making bad choices.
No.
We're talking about society failing to provide young people with the support and opportunities they need to succeed.
Exactly. We can't just arrest our way out of this problem.
Right.
We have to address the root causes if we want real lasting change. And that takes a multifaceted approach involving everyone, policymakers, community leaders, educators, parents, and even young people themselves. It reminds us that we're all connected and that the choices we make individually and as a society have real consequences. We can't just hope someone else will fix this problem.
Yeah.
It's up to all of us to create a world where young people feel safe, supported, and have hope for their future.
Well said. And although our focus has been on the challenges, I want to end on a positive note.
Okay.
There are amazing people and organizations out there working tirelessly to make a difference in the lives of these young people. They're offering alternatives to violence, building stronger communities, and giving young people the tools they need to succeed.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to feel discouraged when we see how big the problem is.
Yeah.
But there are people fighting the good fight, and what they're doing matters.
It does. And you can be one of them. Remember, even small things can have a big impact. Stay informed, get involved in your community, and use your voice to push for change.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about and has motivated you to learn more about this issue and how you can help in your own communities. Remember, this isn't just someone else's problem. It's something that affects us all. And it needs our attention, our empathy, and our action.
Absolutely.
We've talked about a lot in this deep dive into youth violence and knife crime in England.
We have.
It's heavy stuff, but these are conversations we need to have.
Yeah, I agree. And as we wrap up, there's something that's been on my mind. We've talked about taking a more holistic approach.
Yeah.
Addressing the root causes of this violence, not just reacting to it.
Right.
But I think we also need to think about how we talk about these issues as a society.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean?
Well, the language we often use when we talk about youth violence, we use words like crackdowns, punishments, getting tough on crime. And while those things might be necessary sometimes,
Right.
I wonder if that kind of language just reinforces the idea of us versus them, Like it's the good citizens against the young criminals.
I see what you mean. It creates a division, like we're separating ourselves from the problem, not seeing it as something we all need to work on together.
Exactly. And I think that kind of language can make it harder to have those tough conversations about the real reasons behind youth violence, the social and economic factors. It's easier to just focus on punishment than to admit that there are systemic inequalities that make violence more likely.
It's like blaming the individual without looking at the bigger picture that shapes their choices.
Right. And while it's important to hold people accountable for what they do, we also have to remember that these young people are often a product of their environment.
Yeah.
They're growing up in communities that have been neglected, where they don't have many opportunities, and where violence might seem like the only way to survive.
So it's about seeing the whole picture, understanding how everything's connected, and addressing these issues on multiple levels.
Exactly. And I think changing the way we talk about it is a part of that. Instead of saying we need to crack down on youth, maybe we should talk about lifting them up. Instead of focusing on punishment, maybe we should focus on prevention and support.
I love that, lifting them up instead of cracking down. It's a small change in words, but it represents a whole different approach. It shows that we believe in these young people, we want to help them build a future, and we understand that they need our support, not just our judgment.
Exactly. And that change in words needs to come with a change in what we do. We need to invest in those communities that have been left behind. We need to create opportunities for young people to succeed, to feel like they belong and have a purpose. We need to address the inequalities that make violence feel like the only option.
It's a big task, but it feels absolutely necessary. And it's not just about government programs or policies. It's about all of us. Individuals, communities, organizations working together to build a society where young people feel safe, supported, and hopeful about the future.
I agree. We all have a responsibility to create a world where violence isn't normal, where young people are empowered to make good choices, and where they can truly thrive.
This has been such an insightful and challenging conversation. Thank you for helping us understand this complex issue. I think we both learned a lot, and we're leaving this deep dive feeling a mix of sadness and anger, but also hope. And I think we both feel even more committed to being part of the solution.
I agree. It's been a privilege to have this conversation with you to really dig into these important issues.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has encouraged you to learn more about this issue and think about what you can do to help in your own community. Remember, even the smallest actions can have a ripple effect. And together, we can create a world where all young people have the chance to thrive.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.
Are you ready for this?
Yeah, yeah.
Like it like that. Hey yo, listen.
Drop it low to the flow. Oh, oh,
Like it like that.
yeah. Oh, are you ready for this?